Solo leveling has officially come to an end. At least season 2 has. And while we haven't heard when season 3 is going to come out, season 3 coming out has been confirmed. And I'll let you know, as an ardent reader of the solo leveling manhwa, we're only about halfway through the story. So there will still be an additional season after season 3, with the story ending most likely in season 4. So we do still fortunately have a while until we have to have the conversation of what do you do in a life post solo leveling. But for the moment, there's probably a lot of you out there who have a solo leveling sized hole in their chest. And while the spring 2025 season is one of the most loaded anime seasons I've ever seen, a lot of the anime coming out in the spring 2025 season either are nothing like solo leveling or are anime slash danhwa originals, meaning I can't tell you what the story's gonna become. And thus, for all of you out there who adored solo leveling and want something to fill that hole in your chest, today I want to sit down and give you a list of anime that I think could do just that. See, because today I want to talk on 7 anime you should watch if you loved solo leveling. But before we get to breaking down these 7 anime and why they're so much like solo leveling and why you'll love them if you're a solo leveling enjoyer, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. So before diving into a bunch of other anime that I think you'll like because you liked solo leveling, let's quickly break down what makes solo leveling so incredibly popular and why so many people have gravitated towards it over the course of the last couple of years. See, solo leveling is not a unique story in the space of anime. It is a dungeon raiding power fantasy manhwa, one of, if not the most common story arcs in all of manga, manhwa, and danhwa. In fact, I would say the only thing more common than a dungeon raiding power fantasy story is maybe something along the lines of a Kagurabachi-esque story, where the main character has to go on a long journey to collect multiple enchanted or incredibly powerful weapons, usually katanas. But if solo leveling is so incredibly formulaic, why is it so much more popular than all the other stories following that same formula? Well, there's really 3 reasons as I see them. And those 3 reasons are the main character, the animation, and the sense of scale. Let's tackle those one at a time. Like I said earlier, solo leveling is a power fantasy anime, to a T, in the same way that The Rising of the Shield Hero is a power fantasy anime, that Overlord is a power fantasy anime, that Shadow of Eminence is a power fantasy anime. But there's one pretty big difference between solo leveling and all of those other anime that I just listed, and that's the fact that solo leveling, even though it does have many isekai-esque elements, is not an isekai, and therefore Jinwoo, thank the heavens, is not an isekai protagonist. See, isekai is by far and away, from a viewership standpoint, the most popular genre in anime, outside of possibly shonen, but a lot of isekai are shonen. However, unfortunately, pretty much every single isekai in the history of isekai follows roughly the same story beats. I was an incel, I was a NEET, I hated everybody, I was terrible to my parents, but then I died, and now I get a chance to be a better person. Essentially, every isekai boils down to a person who didn't deserve a second chance at life getting the best possible chance at a second life. But that's not the case for Jinwoo. Jinwoo's story starts as Jinwoo as the weakest possible hunter in all of Korea, a country not known for its strong hunters, who puts his life at risk every single day, all in the hopes of either finding a cure or gaining enough money to cure his mother's eternal sleep disease, all the while ensuring that his little sister is getting the education, the attention, the food, and the catering that she needs. And that's when Jinwoo is handed a second chance in the Double Dungeon event. It doesn't feel like some 35-year-old lolicon slash siscon got a second chance at life, but rather that a hardworking individual who put his life on the line for the people that he loved and also was willing to die in order to make sure that everybody else involved in the Double Dungeon event could survive, got a second chance at life. Somebody legitimately deserving of the system and the power that he gains access to, gains access to it. And thus, from the very beginning, Jinwoo is more likable than any MC in the power fantasy genre, making him incredibly popular with the older generation of anime enjoyers, people with completely formed frontal cortexes. Listen, because there was a time, and a large chunk of time in my life, that I wasn't above the concept of power fantasy or isekai or even trashy anime. 16-year-old Nick's favorite anime on earth was High School DxD. I loved the irregular at magic school. SAO is what got me into anime. I've seen every episode. However, unfortunately, as you age, you kind of age out of these tropes. What's even better about Jinwoo and solo leveling as a story is the fact that not only does Jinwoo start as the best possible situation you could have for a protagonist in a power leveling anime, but he stays that way, as the story never gets creepy. He never SAs his 12-year-old cousin, who he eventually marries. He never buys an underage slave who very conveniently grows up into an adult after leveling up a couple times. He's not surrounded by 12 magical girls who are constantly spilling out of their tops. The show does posit possible romances, but never at the cost of the storytelling. And therefore, even though Solo Leveling does fall within the purview of a power fantasy anime, it avoids the creepy pitfalls that so many other isekai and power fantasy anime fall into. The second reason that Solo Leveling is incredibly popular is a pretty straightforward one. It's well animated. See, like it or not, animation matters. The contents of Season 1 and Season 2 of Blue Lock are roughly the same in terms of quality. The story's no better in Season 1 than it is in Season 2, and vice versa. But if you sat somebody down and said, hey, what season of Blue Lock do you prefer more, Season 1 or Season 2, 99% of people are gonna say Season 1. Because even though Season 1 wasn't beautifully animated, it did look better than Season 2. And while animation has always been a big part of an anime's success, it's become more so in recent years, with shows like Demon Slayer, Arcane, and Jujutsu Kaisen showing us that, oh, the upper bounds of animation can absolutely make a story more interesting. Because we're all animals deep down, and when we see smooth, colorful, beautiful animation, yeah, we're willing to forgive a couple of things. So even though Soul Leveling is by far and away not the most interesting story I've ever interacted with, when I get to watch Jinwoo battle it out against Igris the Blood Red with his bare hands and beautiful, stunning 60 FPS 4K goodness, yeah, I'm gonna be sat in my seat for the entirety of that fight, not scrolling anything on my phone. And 1A Pictures has done a fantastic job animating the last 2 seasons of Solo Leveling. And the third and possibly most nuanced thing that makes Solo Leveling so incredibly popular is its sense of scale. See, in just 2 seasons of content, 24 episodes, maybe 25. Yes, actually, for sure, 25. Jinwoo has gone from an E-ranked hunter to a national level hunter. And while there's absolutely pros and cons to his rapid exponential growth, the pros being now we can get to the strongest people in the universe, and the cons being all the S-ranked hunters that got introduced in season 2 pretty much immediately became fodder after being identified as ridiculously strong. And while the sense of scale hasn't necessarily been on full display in the anime yet, with only the Beast Monarch and the Frost Monarch being introduced and them being introduced as monarchs, or really even the concept of monarchs and rulers not even being introduced yet, the true sense of scale that does make Soul Leveling one of the greater power fantasy anime of all time hasn't even really hit its stride yet. However, watching Jinwoo climb up the proverbial ladder of strength, which we're able to gauge based off the rank of the other hunters that are unable to fight against the enemies he's currently fighting against, with the Red Gate dungeon that he does in the beginning of season 2 being a struggle for A and B ranked hunters, while the Jeju Island arc that happens only a couple of episodes after that initial Red Gate features monsters that are too strong for even S ranked hunters who are incomparably stronger than A and B ranked hunters, shows us a true line of linear growth from Jinwoo that makes it satisfying to watch. And thus, with those 3 key aspects in mind here, I was able to find 7 anime that I do genuinely believe check all of those boxes. And thus I'm going to be rating each and every single one of these 7 anime on those 3 aspects on a 1 to 10 scale. Those being MC, animation, and sense of scale. Now, MC is kind of going to be our most vague category because I'm also taking into account some of the other things I talked about with Solo Leveling, like creepiness level of the universe, women spilling out of their tops, just overall haremification of a universe. So MC is going to require some explaining on an anime by anime basis, but we'll get into that. So let's go ahead and get into our rankings with our number 7 spot, Shangri-La Frontier. See, Shangri-La Frontier has been getting a ton of love recently, with many referring to it as the best running isekai going right now. Now, I always hesitate to call a video game anime an isekai. See, because, well, yes, in this universe there is fully immersive VR headsets, and they do bring you to a fantasy world within the confines of this video game, but anything that you can log out of just doesn't feel like an isekai to me. I don't know, that's just my personal preference. See, Shangri-La Frontier has an objectively much less serious tone than Solo Leveling. One, it's in a video game, so anytime the main character, Rakaru, dies, just that he loses progress and has to regrind through certain parts of the video game, and therefore you'll never necessarily find the tension that Solo Leveling is able to provide on account of the fact that these hunters are actually sending their real life bodies into these gates, where many of them, especially if they're in that gate with Jinwoo, never walk out of with. And that's kind of one of the main key issues that I personally have had with Shangri-La Frontier, because while there is a ton of things to adore about this anime, its silliness and lack of general serious tension makes it hard for me to care about what's going on a week-by-week basis. So a lot of you are probably wondering, as I'm sitting here giving Shangri-La Frontier anything but a glowing review, why it's in today's video. Well, that's because for some reason, every single time I say I don't watch Shangri-La Frontier, but that I tried, I get some of the most visceral respond comments of, oh, no. you're gonna try again. Because apparently season 2 is much better than season 1, the only season that I watched. And listen, I do have to give Shangri-La Frontier some of its flowers. It, like Soul Leveling, follows a likable MC. Rockero, our MC of Shangri-La Frontier, isn't a dislikable person. He's a regular high school kid who just happens to have the niche interest of playing terrible video games. And because he's cut his teeth playing terrible video games for the last couple of years and having to learn how to get around bugs and bad play mechanics, when he finally does throw himself into what's considered to be the god game of his universe, the best video game out there, Shangri-La Frontier, he's able to use all of the tricks of the trade that he had to learn from terrible video games to be really good at a good video game. And the anime plays on this idea in a lot of really fun ways that make a lot of sense. And anybody who's played video games, be they bad or good, can relate to how the story is told. Now, the story is objectively the horniest we're going to talk about on this entire list. But it's not like standard isekai levels of horny. It's not Mushoku Tensei, it's not SAO, it's not Overlord. Is there 3 or 4 people thirsting over our MC at any given moment? Yeah. However, the show isn't necessarily egregious about it. On top of that, the show does a really good job of displaying female characters as some of the strongest people in the show. So because the MC is likable, really has nothing going against him, but the show definitely does dip its toes into a harem-esque side sometimes, I'm gonna give the MC category a 7. Now, the animation of Shangri-La Frontier is impressive. It's actually very good, and I've heard that it's even better in season 2. I personally adore the art style. It's bright, the faces have a lot of detail, the shadows are well drawn, and while the fight choreo is sometimes a bit lacking, especially as the show does revolve around a dual-wielding blade user, and therefore in the vein of Solo Leveling or Sword Art Online, there is a ton of capacity for really cool combos that I really feel isn't lived up to its fullest potential in this show. I'm gonna give the animation an 8. Now, for sense of scale, I feel as though I don't have technically the most informed take on this category on account of the fact that I've only seen season 1. But one of the biggest strengths that many people cite that I believe is actually one of its bigger weaknesses is that when you're watching Shangri-La Frontier, it does truly feel like an MMORPG. However, it doesn't feel like you're playing the MMORPG, it feels like you're watching somebody else play it. And while Soul Leveling doesn't take any time to meander down the side quests, Shangri-La Frontier absolutely does. And thus, a couple of times while watching Shangri-La Frontier, I found myself wondering, why are we doing any of this? Questions that I'd never necessarily have to ask myself with Soul Leveling on account of its breakneck pace. So for sense of scale, I'm gonna give Shangri-La Frontier a 6, giving it a total of 21 out of 30 possible points. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh wow, Nick, that's pretty high for the last place entry on this list. But remember, I'm only recommending 7 out of the hundreds of anime that I've seen and know about for you to watch if you like Solo Leveling. Last place should be pretty high up on the list if I want to recommend good recommendations. Now, after Shangri-La Frontier, I actually have 2 anime that are tied for 4th place. There's also 2 anime that are tied for 3rd place. That's why the rankings are kind of all over the place. And the first anime that we'll talk about that's tied in that 4th place spot is Magi, or Magi, or Magi, really whatever you want. The anime's been done for like a decade now, you can call it whatever you want. I'm gonna go with Magi. Oh my god, it stopped airing in 2013, it's been 13 years. Every day I'm one step closer to the grave. Isn't that fun? Anyways, the story of Magi, aka Magi, the Labyrinth of Magic, revolves around a main character known by the name of Aladdin. And if the name Aladdin sounds familiar to you, then yeah, there's going to be a lot more of that, because the story of Magi is the animification of the story of Arabian Nights. You know, that one story with that one song that every TikTok influencer who wanted to start a music career sang at full volume in their biggest room, Arabian Nights. Yeah, it's not going to happen for me. Also known from the hit Disney movie, Aladdin? Anyways, yeah, Magi is a telling of that story. Now, Magi will absolutely scratch the itch for a lot of Soul Leveling fans in the fact that it is a dungeon crawling anime. See, the story of Magi revolves around towers, or dungeons. And 14 years prior to the events of Magi, a ton of these dungeons popped up all around the world. And over the course of those 14,000 years leading up to the events of the story, thousands of people have tried to enter into these dungeons and capture them, but nobody ever came out. Until one day, eventually, one of the dungeons was captured by a man, well, actually more of a child at that time, by the name of Sinbad. Now, this Sinbad character actually has his own 14 anime episode spin-off that we're going to be talking about a little bit later in this very video, but Magi, the main story here, which is a 50 episode anime that actually only adapts about a half of Magi's manga, revolves around 2 characters, Aladdin and Alibaba. And no, not the Chinese shopping app. Now, Aladdin and Alibaba are a bit like Gon and Killua. They are equal weight protagonists. Well, Aladdin would probably be considered, well, if you had to choose one, Aladdin would probably be chosen as the main character of Magi. What the show does well is building out an interesting cast of characters who can all carry the show in their own respective ways. See, in the beginning of the story, Alibaba is just a young man who wants to capture a nearby dungeon, and Aladdin is a traveler who actually controls a jinn, which is the pre-Islamic Arabian idea of basically genies, as we call them in English. Now, the story of Magi revolves around Aladdin and Alibaba trying to live up to their fullest potentials. Alibaba as a king and Aladdin as a Magi. And both of these characters are deeply, deeply lovable MCs. Very different in their own respects and have very different journeys that they need to watch, but come together in the middle to accomplish it with each other. On top of this, the world building in Magi is incredible, and that makes a lot of sense when you consider the fact that it is a 370 chapter manga that actually over the course of just its 50 episode run is able to adapt 198 chapters of said manga at a ridiculous blistering speed of 4 chapters per episode. However, consider the fact that this was an anime and a manga that was created in the early 2010s, it's horny. At least season 1 is horny. There's a lot less fan service in season 2, and so if you can trudge through the first couple of episodes with nothing more than a yeek, then you're gonna get to some pretty peak content. Now, both Aladdin and Alibaba are a lot younger than Jinwoo, so it's actually more of a coming-of-age story as opposed to a quarter-life crisis story like Jinwoo's is, but the characters are lovable, the universe is fantastic, and the bad parts of the story are never enough to take away from the actual enjoyment of the show. So I'm gonna give the MC category for Magi an 8. Now, animation-wise, I genuinely believe the early 2010s were peak animation. I think the anime world actually stagnated in terms of animation until very, and I mean very recently, the last 2 or 3 years. So to me, Magi looks just as good as other anime that was coming out around that time with, like Hunter x Hunter's remake, season 1 of SAO, and a lot of the other higher budget anime that were coming out in that 2012, 2013 range. And so going back and watching Magi, I genuinely still believe that the animation holds up at a high level. Now, does it look like JJK season 2 or 2B Hero X or Arcane? No. So I'll give the animation a 7. However, where Magi absolutely, and I mean absolutely shines is its sense of scale. This is where that blistering 4 chapter an episode pace comes into play. In the same way that Soul Leveling revolves around a down and out good person in the beginning of the story, that is absolutely through their own hard work, determination, and grit, but also kind of being God's favorite, able to eventually transcend to the highest level of powers as they introduce higher and higher level opponents as the world grows outwards. In fact, if I had to compare the linear strength building of Soul Leveling with any universe, it would probably be that of Magi. Yes, there's no actual leveling system like there is in Soul Leveling and in a couple of the other entries we're going to talk about today, but in terms of the introduced scale of the universe and the finished scale of the universe at the end of the story, both Soul Leveling and Magi follow very, and I mean very similar trajectories. And with all that in mind, Magi is going to be sitting at a total of 24 of 30 possible points, which puts it in a direct tie with the other anime tied for 4th place, One Punch Man. See, like it or not, One Punch Man is a power fantasy anime. One Punch Man is a story about a down-and-out businessman who wants to train to break through his limits. A man sick of grinding the 9 to 5 who decides to become a hero as a hobby. And while One Punch Man is certainly more comedically focused than Solo Leveling, there are way, and I mean way too many similarities to ignore. See, while One Punch Man, at least not yet, doesn't revolve around somebody selected by some arbitrary system created by the gods to turn them into a new god, heavy emphasis on the not yet. A lot of people hypothesize that's exactly where One Punch Man's plot is going, but we don't know anything yet. One Punch Man does revolve around a main character in Saitama who, like Jinwoo, through the power of some basic weight training, is able to achieve powers beyond anybody else in the entirety of their own respective universes. I mean, like, legitimately, both Saitama and Jinwoo have the same daily training schedule. 100 push-ups, 100 sit-up, 100 crunches, and a 10-kilometer run. Now, while the penalty for Jinwoo not doing this is being transported to a universe filled with gigantic millipedes, the punishment for Saitama would be, I don't know, probably not being as strong. However, through the power of this training regimen and a bunch of fights, both Jinwoo and Saitama are able to level up their powers far beyond any of their peers. Oh, Nick, but Jinwoo isn't one-punching any of his opponents. Yeah, you're right. But if you think that when Jinwoo steps into literally any battle in Solo Leveling that he's about to lose, then you're missing the point of the story. Jinwoo is a power fantasy manhwa protagonist. He is going to win as often as Saitama. Saitama was created as a gag on characters like Jinwoo. Now, the inherently more comedic aspects of One Punch Man that pull a lot of the attention of the story away from Saitama because he's just not that interesting make Jinwoo a much more interesting character than the main character of One Punch Man, Saitama. However, this could be identified as either a strength or a weakness of the One Punch Man manga. Yes, is Jinwoo a more interesting character than Saitama? 100%. Saitama's only interest in modern day life are to earn enough money to stay alive, be left alone by everybody, and play video games with King. Jinwoo's motivation, story arcs, and power-ups are just more interesting than Saitama's. However, because Saitama is so uninteresting, and because the mangaka of One Punch Man 1 knows that Saitama is uninteresting, they spend a lot of time focusing on other characters in the story, like Genos, Blizzard, Terrible Tornado, and more recently Blast. Saitama's now treated more like a gag or a mop to clean up a fight in his own story than the main character. And ironically, this gigantic cast of characters that are all interesting and take time away from the MC is the exact opposite of the issue that Solo Leveling has, which is that the MC is the only character in the entire story with any amount of interest whatsoever, and therefore when you try to ask a Solo Leveling fan to name 3 characters in Solo Leveling that aren't Jinwoo or any of his shadow soldiers, they run into some issues. Now, One Punch Man can be horny, especially with characters like Terrible Tornado, Do S, Mosquito, and a lot of other female characters. Much like with Magi, it's never necessarily at a level where you're like, okay, I need to stop watching One Punch Man because of this. It's just some female designs are inherently horny. It's not like they're getting their clothes knocked off. And thus, while I do genuinely believe that Saitama isn't all that interesting as a main character, I think what he stands for is interesting, and his supporting cast of characters is some of the best in manga today. So I'm gonna give the MC category for One Punch Man an 8. However, answering for animation for One Punch Man is a bit more difficult. See, anybody who's watched One Punch Man will tell you that season 1 is better animated than season 2. And this is inherently true. They switched animation studios between season 1 and season 2, and it is noticeable. But it's really only noticeable because season 2 is animated like any other anime, and season 1 is some of the most gorgeous animation you'll ever see in your entire life. So season 2 gets a 8-ish in terms of animation, season 1 gets a 10, and therefore we'll give the entire show a 9. Now, the sense of scale of One Punch Man's manga and its anime are vastly different, as the anime has yet to adapt to the best parts of the manga, at least in my opinion, and therefore I will say, at least currently, the sense of scale in the One Punch Man anime is kind of lacking. I mean, the first thing that we ever see Saitama do within the first couple of minutes of episode 1 is explode a giant that is several thousand feet tall. And while yes, at the end of season 1, he battles against Biru, who's an alien so incredibly powerful that the rest of the S-ranked heroes really stand no chance, and also the first thing since Saitama fought against the Subterraneans that was able to survive one punch. The sense of scale that's built up in season 1 is unfortunately kind of ratcheted back in season 2, as it takes a couple of seasons for Garo, the main villain of season 2 and season 3, to build up into their final form. However, once we do get to, in season 3, which is coming out this year, Garo and Saitama's final fight, then boy oh boy does the sense of scale get blown out the roof. But for the moment, as season 3 is not out, we'll give One Punch Man a sense of scale of 7, putting it in a tie position with Magi. Sorry, I had the podcast filmed, and then it was Magic the Gathering night at my house, so, you know, that was more important than work. So it's a new day. Anyways, now that we've covered One Punch Man, let's get to the 2 anime we have tied for 3rd on this list. With our first being that show we talked about earlier, the spin-off of Magi, The Adventures of Sinbad. See, The Adventures of Sinbad, instead of focusing on Aladdin and Alibaba, focus on the first dungeon capturer in the entirety of the Magi universe, Captain Sinbad. Now, Sinbad, while an important character in the main Magi timeline, is already established as a prolific figure who's one of the strongest people in the entire universe, if not the strongest, and therefore, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of capacity for him to be a truly interesting character in the main Magi universe. It'd kind of be like if Jinwoo started his story as strong as he currently is at the end of episode 25. Yeah, it's cool to see him fly in and destroy a bunch of monsters, but I want to see how he got there. And that's what we get with The Adventures of Sinbad. See, because long before Sinbad was the king of Sindria, he was just a small boy born to an incredibly humble beginning, much like Jinwoo, to his father Badr and his mother Ezra. However, unfortunately, one day Sinbad's father is sent off to war where he dies, leaving Sinbad, much like Jinwoo, alone to take care of his sick mother. And while Sinbad is alone taking care of his sick mother, one day he stumbles upon a mysterious figure who he decides to give shelter to. Now, it's later revealed that this mysterious figure is a man by the name of Yunnan, who is one of, at this time, the 4 Magi of the Magi world. And as Yunnan is a Magi without a king candidate, he actually decides to make Sinbad his king candidate. And thus Yunnan guides Sinbad to the closest dungeon, a dungeon by the name of Ball, and Sinbad goes on with this newfound power granted to him by his connection to this Magi to conquer this dungeon, becoming the first ever dungeon conqueror, granting him all the wealth, riches, and powers that lay within this dungeon, which he uses to start an adventure across many different lands, connecting with people from different backgrounds and tribes, and slowly amassing a crew that he would sail the world with and conquer other dungeons with, until he eventually became the most broken person in the Magi universe. And if any of this is sounding like Solo Leveling, it's because because, yeah, they're really similar. And thus, if you're looking for a solo leveling vibe, I really do think Sinbad's about as close as you're gonna get. He is a good person from humble beginnings who took care of his sick mother, and through strength, determination, grit, and being a good person was eventually granted godlike powers that he uses to adventure across the globe, gaining new friends along the way and new powers, until eventually he becomes the strongest person in the universe. So if I had to give the MC category of the Adventures of Sinbad a score, I'd say when comparing it to solo leveling, it gets a 10. Now, for animation, I can't really say that the Adventure of Sinbad looks any better than Magi, and thus I'd probably have to give it the same animation score that I gave to Magi, which was a 7. However, as this is a substantially shorter story than Magi, having, as of 2017, only 13 volumes, as opposed to Magi's 37 volumes, and having only 13 episodes as opposed to Magi's 50 episodes, unfortunately, I do have to dock the sense of scale a little bit. Yes, we see Sinbad get wildly powerful pretty quickly. Unfortunately, we never get to the magical godlike mumbo-jumbo stuff that Magi eventually gets to, because that's what the Magi story is meant for. This is just telling how Sinbad became Sinbad. So for sense of scale, I'm gonna give the Adventures of Sinbad an 8, as opposed to Magi's 9, giving the Adventures of Sinbad a total score of 1 point higher than Magi, 25. But what's the show that's tied with the Adventures of Sinbad? Well, that'd be the show lovingly known as DanMachi, aka Is It Wrong to Try and Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon? And yeah, with a title like that, you can understand why they'd abbreviate it to DanMachi. See, this is a story built around a main character by the name of Belle, a character longing for the adventure that he heard about in stories growing up. Travels to the land of Aurario to explore the vast labyrinth that exists there that's simply known as the dungeon. See, inside of this dungeon in Aurario, there is an endless supply of monsters that only get more powerful the further into the dungeon you go. And thus, in response to the sudden existence of this dungeon, multiple gods and goddesses from, I believe, only the Greek pantheon, but there might be more, descended down to Earth, giving up their divine powers, but in exchange gaining the ability to grant powers onto mortal humans. Now, because of this, there are some incredibly popular and powerful families, usually denoted to how powerful that god was in the Greek pantheon, with gods like Ares and Apollo having massively powerful and huge families. However, Belle is not a part of one of those massively powerful and or huge families, as he is actually the lone member of the Hestia family. See, as Hestia is the goddess of hearth and home, she is a minor god in the Greek pantheon, and therefore nobody really wants her blessing. However, as Belle is a scrawny, fledgling adventurer, nobody really wants him on their family either. Now, in the early part of Belle's adventure exploring the dungeons, he's attacked by a minotaur who was chased up from the lower levels by higher level adventurers and almost dies. However, before he dies, he's saved by a first-class adventurer by the name of Ice Wallenstein, who he immediately falls in love with. However, upon realizing the massive gap in their strength, Belle steels himself for the reality that if he ever wants to stand a chance at making this woman fall in love with him, he needs to get stronger and fast. Now, what Belle doesn't know is that he has an ability known as Liar's Freeze, which allows for him to grow in strength much more rapidly than anybody else, setting him on the journey of eventually reaching a level of power that's comparable to that of the first-rate adventurer who saved him and the love of his life, Ice. And the story of strength for love is told in a very solo leveling-esque way. Like solo leveling, it is also a dungeon crawler, and like solo leveling, it also has a literal leveling mechanic, as every time that Belle receives enough experience through his time in the dungeon, he's able to go to Hestia, his goddess, who's able to adjust his stats and give him new abilities. And thus we get to see through this leveling mechanic, Belle turn into a greater and greater adventurer. On top of that, Belle is a good person. He's never overly creepy. He wanted to become an adventurer because he heard about the stories as a kid. He is a very, and I mean very, lovable MC. However, he is a lovable MC thrust into one of the hornier worlds you're gonna experience. I mean, Hestia's character design alone should tell you everything that you need to know about this universe, and the name of the show is, after all, Is It Wrong to Try and Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon? Much heavier romance aspects run through this show than run through solo leveling. Yes, Jinwoo in solo leveling does have about 3 women who are interested in him. However, the romance aspects are really never a major talking point in solo leveling. The same can not be said for DanMachi. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this is a harem anime, but over the course of all of the seasons of DanMachi that are currently out, you could feasibly ship Belle with like 8 women. Like, yeah, is he in love with Eyes and is trying to get with Eyes the entire story? 100%. But does that stop every woman he meets from trying to make babies with him? Now, so while Belle is an awesome MC who's given a wholesome beginning to his story, if sometimes heavy harem aspects are going to take you out of the story, then it may not be for you. And thus I give Is It Wrong to Try and Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon or DanMachi an 8 in the MC category. Now, animation-wise, this show looks great. It's never awe-inspiring, but it is very good. The fight choreography is fantastic, the lighting elements are great, I adore the character design, but it's not like Solo Leveling or Season 2 of JJK or the Entertainment District arc. So for animation, I'm going to have to give DanMachi an 8. However, where DanMachi does truly start to shine is its sense of scale. See, DanMachi essentially operates like the first season of SAO, but in reverse. Instead of trying to get through all 100 levels of Aincrad, going up every single level, DanMachi works in the opposite way, in a way that a lot of dungeon crawlers often do. That is to say that the deeper into the dungeon you get, the higher level the monsters and the higher level the mysteries. Because while the idea of, oh wow, we're on level 30, this has got even bigger minotaurs is a kind of interesting premise, on top of the enemies getting stronger as we get deeper into the dungeon, a lot of the mysteries behind the dungeon's existence and Auraria as a place begin to get revealed. And thus, for sense of scale, I have to give DanMachi a 9, tying it with the Adventures of Sinbad at a total of 25 points. And with that, both of the anime tied for third place are out of the way. So let's get to our top 2. Coming up in second place is an anime that came out very recently, and an anime that I'm currently waiting for a second season for, Wistoria, Wand and Sword. Now, some of you might have already watched this when it came out a couple of seasons ago, but it did fly relatively under the radar. At least I believe it flew relatively under the radar for how good it was. Wistoria, Wand and Sword follows a main character by the name of Will, who in a very common premise attends a magical school with no ability to use magic. And if I've already started to lose you with that incredibly basic premise, hold on a second. See, because Will isn't your classic incel wet dream. Usually in things like the irregular at magic school or the Demon King Academy or whatever it's called, the main characters are kind of insufferable edgelords who use their massive power to take out all their bullies, aka what I call an incel wet dream. However, Will and Wistoria, Wand and Sword do not fall under that categorization. Will is one of the most lovable MCs of all time. He is funny, aloof, hardworking, has a concrete goal, is willing to forgive those who trespass against him. At literally every single possible turn, Will makes objectively the right decision. He holds no grudges against those who hate him simply based off the fact that he is a lack magic. There's no Rising of the Shield Hero moment where he makes everybody hate this one person to the point where they all call her bitch. He just proves time and time again to all of those who hate him for being a lack magic that doesn't inhibit his ability to grow. And he doesn't do it because he's God's favorite or stumbled upon some demon sword. He does it because he works ridiculously hard. And he works ridiculously hard because he wants to be reconnected with his childhood best friend and the love of his life, who's one of, if not the most impressive magician in the Wistoria Wand and Sword world. And therefore, because of her incredible magical prowess, she's been separated to the top of magic society, which Will can't access as somebody who's not at the top of magical society. Now, I will admit that this show is not a 100% dungeon crawler. There is a magical dungeon that exists below the magical school that Will attends, and that's where he cuts his teeth to be as strong as possible to keep up with all the magic users around him. But there's also classic magical school tropes, like a Goblet of Fire-esque competition, and Will just needing to go to class to get high enough grades to graduate. However, the true meat of the show does happen in the dungeons, which is also where a lot of the best fights happen. And thus, from a premise perspective and an MC perspective, I think if you love Solo Leveling and Jinwoo, you're gonna love Wistoria. And thus, I give Wistoria's MC category a 10. On top of that, if you love how fights from Solo Leveling are animated and choreographed, you're gonna love Wistoria, as I would actually argue that the first season of Wistoria has better fights and better animation than season 1 of Solo Leveling. Because almost every single, and I mean almost every single episode of season 1 of Wistoria has an Igris the Blood Red level fight. I'm not kidding. If you don't believe me, literally just watch the first episode. And if you're not impressed with the animation or the fight choreography after episode 1, don't worry, there's like 12 more chances to be impressed. So in the animation category, I'm also gonna have to give Wistoria a 10 out of 10. And the only point that Wistoria actually loses when comparing it to Solo Leveling is its sense of scale, which I feel like is actually kind of unfair to Wistoria because it only has 1 season out, and I haven't read the manga. But even if I did read the manga is actually not that far along. The Wistoria manga was so massively beloved that only 30 or 40 chapters into its manga run, it got an anime adaptation. So while some further down the line problems have absolutely been introduced, like the fact that the magical bubble that all the highest level mages use to protect the magical school is slowly decaying, I'm not entirely sure where that's gonna go. But based off simply from what we know about season 1, and the fact that we need to watch Will go from a lack magic, no talent, nothing magical student to a high level graduate of that magic Magic Academy to accepted into the magical tower at the highest level is a sense of progression and scale that we already have established and need to see just from season 1. And on top of that, none of those things have happened yet. Tie that into the fact that there is real life outside of magical school consequences that are being brought into the Wistoria universe, and it seems as though Wistoria has a high capacity to introduce some high level sense of scale. So in the sense of scale category, I'm going to give Wistoria a 9, bringing it to a total of 29 points and giving it our second place spot. But if Wistoria got such glowing remarks and is only in second place, then what could possibly be in first? Well, that'd be none other than my favorite anime of all time, Hunter x Hunter. Don't act surprised. You shouldn't be. Here's the thing. I'm not just throwing Hunter x Hunter in at the one spot because it's my favorite anime of all time. I'm throwing Hunter x Hunter in because a lot of soul leveling comes from Hunter x Hunter. Listen, I'm not saying that soul leveling is a copy of Hunter x Hunter at all. They are very, very different stories. However, you cannot, with a pattern discerning brain, say that some aspects of solo leveling may have been inspired by Hunter x Hunter. Yes, Hunter x Hunter is not a power fantasy novel, it's straight up shonen, and Gon loses a lot more than Jinwoo ever does. However, at the end of the day, solo leveling, like Hunter x Hunter, is a story about a boy who comes from an incredibly powerful father, who commits his entire life to becoming a hunter, and whose goal as a hunter is to be able to reconnect with one of his parents. In Gon's case, it's Jing. In Jinwoo's case, it's his mother, and whose hunter's journey not only makes the two main characters stronger in all feasible ways, but also leads them to a myriad of dark and dangerous situations, some of which that include ants. Listen, fundamentally, solo leveling and Hunter x Hunter are very different stories. However, at their core, genuinely, if you enjoy solo leveling, there's really no reason to believe that you wouldn't enjoy Hunter x Hunter. Both the MCs are good, relatable, and lovable people who, while they both hesitate to kill, don't necessarily shy away from the concept when it becomes a necessity. Neither of these shows are even remotely perfect, with the worst thing in Hunter x Hunter being the fact that Gon has to take Palm out on a date, and I mean, that's not great, but it does happen. And both Jinwoo and Gon are surrounded by a cast of characters that are lovable and support them from the shadows, whether that be Jinho in Jinwoo's case, or Killua in Gon's case. And while obviously Hunter x Hunter is more story about Killua and Gon, and therefore two main protagonists, than solo leveling, which is basically just about Jinwoo, that's an argument that a lot of people use against solo leveling's greatness, and therefore Hunter x Hunter has a pretty good answer to it, which is two incredibly lovable protagonists. And while Hunter x Hunter itself doesn't necessarily have the dungeon crawly aspects of solo leveling, both its Greed Island arc and its Chimera Ant arc definitely have dungeon crawly vibes, as the main characters of the story are essentially transported to otherworldly like biomes filled with monsters and monstrous people, all to defeat. So when it comes down to it, what am I giving Hunter x Hunter, my favorite anime of all time across the board? A 30. Gon is my favorite main character of all time. He's deeply relatable. His journey is one of the best written of all time. The animation absolutely holds up for being done in 2013. With Hunter x Hunter still having some of the most impressive fights in all of anime, like Gon versus Hisoka, or Netero versus Meruem, and the sense of scale of this universe is literal perfection. As in every single arc, a new higher level of bad guy is introduced, but it never feels like they're trying to outscale themselves. And tie that into the fact that there is the constant looming threat of the Dark Continent, and I don't think there's ever personally been another manga that's been able to scale its sense of scale so perfectly and so linearly over such a long course of time. So yeah, Nick gives his favorite manga and anime of all time a 30 out of 30 possible points. What'd you expect? But I'm curious to hear from you guys. If you had to suggest an anime for a friend of yours to watch, if they loved solo leveling, what would you suggest and why? Tell me about it in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go rewatch season 1 of Wistoria.